Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's lecture, Tracing Women's Partition Experiences, Oral and Material Memories. This event has been organized by Citi CSMVS Museum on Wheels in collaboration with Partition Museum, and we are extremely delighted to have you all here. My name is Atrey, and I work with the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangralaya, Mumbai. Before we welcome our esteemed speaker to begin today's talk, I would like to take this opportunity to tell you all a little bit about our museum. The CSMVS is located in Kalaghora, Mumbai. Apart from our brilliant multicultural collections, the museum building itself is a heritage site. 2022 is a monumental year for us as we recently celebrated our centenary a few weeks back on the 10th of January. The museum architecture is a combination of Hindu, Islamic, and Gothic styles and is also a Grade 1 heritage building as per UNESCO norms. Today, the museum houses over 70,000 artifacts and has been doing a variety of educational and outreach activities over the past few years. CSMVS is currently closed for visitors due to COVID regulations, but we hope you will visit us soon once the situation improves. Museum on Wheels is an outreach initiative of CSMVS where if you cannot come to the museum comes to you in the form of a bus. We have two buses in our fleet currently, which travel to the far-reaching parts of Mumbai and the outskirts of Maharashtra, reaching out to those who cannot physically come to the museum. The team also conducts exhibition tours and educational programming along with the bus visit. This project has been very successful and is supported by our partners, Citi India. Now, coming to today's lecture, I would like to introduce our speaker, Ms. Ganeev Dhillon. Ganeev works as a curator at the Partition Museum. She is involved in research and curating the museum's exhibitions, collecting oral histories, and building the museum's archives. She has been involved with the Partition Museum since 2016. We request all participants to write their questions for our speaker in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. We will be taking them up at the end of today's lecture. So without further ado, over to you, Ms. Dhillon.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ganeev and I work with the Partition Museum. And I'll be taking you through the presentation today. But just before we begin, just briefly about the Partition Museum. The Partition Museum is the world's first museum dedicated to the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. The museum at Amritsar opened to the public on August 17, 2017. And we are a people's museum. We focus on telling the stories of people through the oral histories and the objects connected with the partition, connected with the migration and the stories of people resettling and rebuilding their lives. And that is truly the heart of the museum. But along with that, we also look at the documents and archival newspapers and documents and use all of it to come together and tell the story of the partition. Our focus has been to try and bring in as many different voices and stories as we can. So we tell stories from all sides, from across the border, as well as of people who migrated to India and people who migrated from India, from whether it's Punjab or Sindh or Bengal, as well as those who migrated to East Pakistan or West Pakistan. And we want the museum to be as representative as possible, because there was no one side or one community that could claim to be the victims in the partition. And when we collect our stories, we reach out to the partition survivors, often through our friends and families. That is how the museum started, who further put us in touch with their family and friends. And so in this process of building the museum, we also build a community. And very often people stay in touch with us, or sometimes to talk generally about the museum, or to know what the museum is doing next, or to put us in touch with other people that they might have connected with in the time, in recent times. So there is an investment in the museum, and it is the people who truly make the Partition Museum. We are currently working on opening a Partition Museum in Delhi also. We are hoping to open it in the Dara Shikoh Library building, which is located in the Ambedkar University in near Kashmiri Gate in Delhi. I'll start with the presentation now, and we'll be looking at some of the, the presentation. Also, I'll be using the material that we've collected for the museum, whether it's general research or objects and oral histories, to go through today's talk. So that's the town hall building located in Amritsar. That's where the museum is located, in the right-hand side wing, where you can see the two white doors at the bottom right corner. It's very close to the Golden Temple. So if you visit Amritsar, do visit the museum there. The partition of the subcontinent is one of the key defining events of history. Up to 18 million people were affected, and up to 1 million people lost their lives. And a lot of work has been done on the partition, and much has been written about it, looking at it from different angles and viewpoints. In today's talk, we will be focusing on the women's experience and tracing the women's experience of the partition through oral and material memories. Before we start, please note that some of these stories are disturbing. I'm going to play a small video, but before that, let me introduce Kausar Jahabigam. She was 12 years old at the time of partition and was living in the Sabzi Mandi area in Delhi. And when the violence started, the family decided to move into the old city of Delhi, within the walled city of Delhi. And that was something that was the first step that people, when they were migrating, often took. Nobody thought that just because violence had broken out or they were not feeling safe in their houses meant that they would necessarily have to leave the city or the region and move to a different country. On both sides of the border, people first often moved to an area where they felt they might be safe, or to refugee camps that had been set up within the city. So Kausar Jahabigam first moved out with her family, with her father, her parents, and her sister. And while they were walking towards the walled city, they met a kafila which had some protection from the military and the police. But while walking in the kafila, the father and her sisters got separated while she was with her mother. And they ultimately met up with each other at a relative's house in Matia Mahal within the walled city. And in this interview, she talks of how they left their homes without carrying anything with them, while other people that they met on the way had managed to bring together some of their belongings.
जब हम अपने घरों से निकल जाए तो हमने क्या देखा, वो रानियों की औरतें अपने संदूकों में से निकाल के जेवर और पैसा इस तरीके से यहाँ रख के यहाँ बांध देंगे। अब हमसे चले जाए तो अपने घर में सब छोड़ जाए, हमारे किसी ने कुछ भी नहीं रहने दिया और न कोई लाए। जब हम उन घरों में से निकल रहे थे, तब देखा कि बाप के घर में जो संदूकों में से निकाल के पैसे और जेवरात सब आपने जमा यहाँ कर दिया। वो तो कुछ भी अपने साथ नहीं लाए, हमारे मम्मा कुछ भी नहीं लाए, वो सब मैं छोड़ के आ गए। जब वो रानियों को निकल जाता, जब हम अपने घरों से निकल जाए तो हमने क्या देखा।
Right. So she talks about how when they left, they didn't carry anything, but when they were coming ahead into a wealthier area, they noticed that the women there had managed to, they were bringing together their jewelry and their clothes. They were they had managed to carry some of the things in trunks, and they were carrying those with them. So the experiences of people as they migrated varied Some people managed to bring across some of their things, others did not manage to carry across anything at all. The wealthier you were, the higher the chances that you managed to bring your certain things at least with you when you migrated or moved even within the city, which is what happened for a lot of Muslims who chose to stay on in India. Um, I'm just going to take you through some of the objects that the women have carried with them and have donated to the museum. On the left is a Fulkari coat that was carried by Gurpreet, that has been donated by Gurpreet Kaur Maini. This was carried across by a lady who was 19 years old at that time. And if you look at it, it's not a very practical object. It wouldn't have been of use to her in a practical sense after migrating. But as a young 19-year-old girl, this was probably her most expensive, most special piece of clothing that she owned. And this was one thing that she brought across with her when she was put on a train with her younger brother by her parents to come across and to Amritsar. Her parents came across later. And she was engaged at that time. And the family had, of course, lost touch with her fiance. But they managed to meet up by chance in the Khalsa College refugee camp. And they got married shortly thereafter. This Fulkari coat has been donated to the museum by the family. On the right-hand side is a sari that has been donated by Helen Carr. It had been gifted to her at her marriage by her mother-in-law. And when she migrated from East Pakistan to Calcutta, she brought this sari with her. So these are two items that are of extreme sentimental and emotional value for these women who brought them with them. Now, these two items are completely different. You have a sewing machine and you have utensils. And these are items of practical use. And for women, at that time in the 1940s, the sewing machine was often one of the most important items that a woman could own. It was often given in dowry. It helped make life so much easier. It was a new thing that had been introduced to the subcontinent. And it was one of the prized possessions for women. And when they walked across, many women brought across their sewing machines with them because it was something that they knew it would help them do their work. It would also, many women also used them after migrating to start doing work of stitching and putting together clothes for other people and selling them. Utensils were another thing that a lot of women brought with them because they knew that while they were migrating, they would need this, whether it was to cook food or eat food. And it's something that just shows what are the thoughts that a woman was going through when they had to leave their homes. What were the most important things that they immediately thought of? And what we've also noticed is that a lot of the things that are given to us by the men who migrated relate to property papers or certificates, school certificates, education certificates that they had received. And those were things that they knew that they would need when after migrating to start building their lives again, to get a job again, to claim property in the new country that they moved to. So it's just a contrast between a lot of the things that women focused on bringing across and some of the things that men focused on bringing across. This is a lady who migrated from Boraya village in Barishal. And she remembers that they took a steamer from Jhalakoti to Bongaon. And what she talks about in this is that when they were migrating, the family, her mother and she, chose to bring across spices with them because they knew that they would have to cook along the way and spices would not be available. So that is one of the things that she remembers, that along with the utensils that they also got spices with them. This is a copy of the Murakkai Chugtai, which is a book which was printed in Lahore in the 1920s with paintings by Abdur Rahman Chugtai, and it has a full text of the Diwan-e-Ghalib. This was brought across by a lady called Rajni Rosha, who was also a young girl at that time from Lahore. And this was one of her favorite books. So she chose to bring this across, one of the things that she managed to bring across with her from Lahore. This lady her name is Sudarshana Kumari. She was just 8 years old at the time of the partition. And she walked across in a kafila with her mother. And she remembers that when they were walking across, at one point of time, they had to spend the night in a camp on the way. And as children who were not really aware of what was happening, she and a few other children walked into a burnt out house next to the place where they were encamping. And they were trying to see if they could find anything of value in that burnt down house. And she remembers that she found this box, this little trunk there, and she picked it up. And her thoughts at that time were that, she had left behind all her dolls in Pakistan, and that when she came across to India, to her new house, she would get new dolls, and she would keep these dolls in this box.
मेरे को दो पटारी मिली, एक बड़ी थी एक छोटी, और एक ये सुंदूकड़ी मेरे को यहाँ से मिली, ऐसे गिरी पड़ी, खोई हुई। मैं खुश हो गई, मैंने बोला ये पटारियों में मैं अपने गुड्डा गुड्डी के कपड़े डालूंगी और इसमें सब मैं अपने रखूंगी। गुड़िया गुड़िया रोने लगी, मेरी गुड़िया जो सब याद है। फिर मैं सोचा कोई बात नहीं, इसमें जाके हिंदुस्तान में गुड़िया कहते हैं ना, से चंद्री चुराए मेरी गुड़िया पटोले, किसे चंद्रे चुरा ले मेरी गुड़िया पटोले।
When she talks about leaving their home for the last time, she in fact, it's quite poignantly she narrates it, and she says that it was evening time and my mother had started the chulla and we were making food, and then suddenly we saw that fire had started in another part of the village, and we could hear shouts of people telling, shouts coming from a place, and we knew that violence was happening. So we just started jumping over roofs from one rooftop to another. And because at that time the houses used to be interconnected. And she ends by saying कि हम भागते भागते बेघर हो गए.
मेरे को दो पटारी मिली, एक बड़ी थी एक
छोटी. When women had to migrate, they also carried with them a lot of other fears in addition to the experiences that men faced. Women feared that they might be abducted, they might be raped, they might be carried off, but they also feared that they might be killed by their own family members. While other women chose that killing themselves was better than being dishonored. And so a lot of women were killed by their own family members. They would either be shot or beheaded with a sword. Others committed suicide either by fire or by jumping into wells or jumping off buildings or consuming an overdose of opium. And this photograph is from one of the galleries in the Partition Museum at Amritsar, sort of in remembrance of the many women who jumped into wells. One of the most known incidents is that of Thua Khalsa, where more than 80 women jumped into a well. And this is a plaque at the Golden Temple. And it's very interesting because while we anyway do not have the names of the people who died during the partition, we know even lesser about the women who suffered at that time or who were killed at that time. And this is a list of all the people who were killed from one village on September 1st, 1947. It's a list of 240 people. Of these, 18 women were killed by their relatives, which is the list that's being translated on the left. In addition, 19 women and children jumped into a well and killed themselves. And after that list follows the list of others who were killed. This memorial tablet was put up by Dr. Virsa. And the first two names on this, Kartar Kaur, wife of Dr. Virsa, and Savinder Kaur, daughter of Dr. Virsa. So they're related to him. And he was the person who maintained this list of everyone lost from his village and memorialized it. Now, on the Bengal side, the story is different to the extent that the migration is, in Punjab, the migration and the violence was compressed. While on the Bengal side, it was decades long and was ongoing for over a long period of time. The violence in Punjab was much more intense versus being less so on the Bengal side. And the concept of the border on the Bengal side is something that happened over decades. You have the 1905 partition of Bengal, you have the 1947 and then 1971. But to the extent of violence that was faced by women at any point, it was the same. Women embodied the honor of the community, and so there were similar forces at play. This is a book written by Jyotirmoy Devi called, translated into English as The River Churning, and which I've just taken a small extract here, which is talking about the similar thoughts that are going through the minds of a girl's family when she returns, when she joins them after having spent many months in East Pakistan. Pinjar is a film that is based off Amrita Preetham's book called Pinjar, and it focuses on the stories of the abducted women, written very much from the point of view of women, and captures the thoughts and feelings of women. Puro, who is the protagonist of the book, she was abducted long before the partition, and her name had been changed to Hamida. And she has no family once the partition, after she's been abducted. And this extract that is here captures her thoughts, that she gathers strays, and she is kind to a woman who's lost her mental balance and who gets raped, and then she adopts her child, but that child is taken away. And Pura is talking about why she needs to get people, have some connection with people around her. And a lot of women who were abducted and ended up marrying some of their people, some of the men who had abducted them and raped them, and building new lives with them. And this is something that was very difficult for men to often recognize. A lot of the women who wrote about it, who were involved in the rehabilitation of women, they speak about the fact that the abducted women often remarried their abductors, they started their life again, they had children again, and then to take them away from that second family where they had started a new life, often in forced conditions, and taking them back to the original family when that original family may or may not have accepted them, was something that was being done purely on the lines of religion deciding a woman's destiny. And these decisions were being taken by the men in the offices, in the parliament, without any input from the women who had to live with those choices that were being made for them. This extract is from a short story by Kulwant Singh Virk called Khabbal. There's a woman who's been abducted and she's lost all hope. And the narrator is unable to get her to leave with him. But what she asks for from him is to help her find her sister-in-law. She says that, I know that my sister-in-law is in a neighboring village. She's my husband's younger sister. And if you can just get her to me in Pakistan itself, I will get her married to someone here, and I shall then have relatives and someone to call my own. So in the circumstances in which these women found themselves, there were many forces, many emotions at play, and they often thought of the fact that they had no other option. There was no surety that they would be accepted by their own families or by the society, because many of their own family members felt that they should have killed themselves instead of letting themselves be dishonored. So as I said, like, because for a woman, her religion was decided by the religion of her family, of her husband or her father. Similarly, a woman could not really choose her place of residence. If your family moved to India, if they were Hindu or Sikh and they moved to India, then India was for a woman, that was the place that you belonged to. And if you were a Muslim and your husband or father chose to migrate to Pakistan, the woman did not really have a choice of choosing India to stay on. So this particularly affected Muslim women. In events where marriages broke up or the husband died and there was a widow left and her husband's family did not care about her, want to take on her responsibility, and she wanted to return to India to her natal family, this was often very difficult for her to do. And so what would often happen is that the women would come back to India, to their own families, to their original families, their natal families, and then remarry Indian nationals, because this was the only way that they could choose to be in India. This film, Mammo, is the script was written by Khalid Muhammad, who also wrote the script for Zubeda. And it's based off the story of his grandmother's sister, Mahmooda Begum, who wants to come back to India after her husband's died. But it's extremely difficult for her to do so, as she keeps getting troubled by the police for overstaying her visa, and they keep deporting her to Pakistan, saying that she has no right to be in India. So ultimately, she pretends that she has died, and the family pretends that she's been buried, so that she can stay untroubled in India. A really great book on this aspect of citizenship and how it affected people is The Long Partition by Wazira Fazila Yaqub Ali Zamindar. A lot of the women got involved, who were not themselves affected by the partition, got involved in the recovery of abducted women. And some of the famous names are Mridula Sarabhai, her photographs on the left here, Rameshwari Nehru, Kamla Ben Patel, Anis Kidbai, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay. And all these women connected with the experiences of the abducted women, of the recovered women as women. And they were much more understanding about the difficult choices that these women had to make than the men folk were. There's a beautiful book by Kamla Ben Patel, which has been translated into English as Torn from the Roots, where she talks about the fact that experiencing and being with the women who had been abducted and seeing them make these difficult choices, often against what the state decreed they should be choosing, was an eye-opening experience for her. This is Gulshan Nanda. She was in Delhi at that time. She was pursuing a BA in economics from Indraprastha College for Women, and her father worked in the Ministry of Finance. So she herself, while her family did belong to Multan, her immediate family was not affected by the partition. However, her sister Rajesh Nandini, who she got involved with rehabilitating women in the refugee camps in Delhi. And Gulshan Nanda also talked about how her sister realized that while the men folk could go out to get employment and could focus their minds on rebuilding their lives, the women in the refugee camps had no outlet for their grief, and they had nothing else to occupy their mind. So Nandini then created a sense of community in the camp by encouraging women to take up embroidering and stitching. Gulshan herself was a young girl at that time, and one of the things that the government came up with at that time was that final year undergrad students who might not be able to complete their degrees due to the partition were offered graduation degrees in return for 6 months of voluntary work at refugee camps. And Gulshan took up that opportunity and became closely involved in working in the refugee camps in Delhi.
What I did was chota mota kaam. Whatever was to be distributed, the utensils that had to be distributed, I was sent to Ajmeri Gate to the College of Engineering, and I used to work there. That was also a refugee camp. What I did was Chota Mota.
This is a picture of some of the women who were recovered and at the camp itself before they were sent across the border. Um, this was shared with us by Pushbinder Singh, whose father was posted at Amritsar and helped a lot of recovered women. And there are many stories. In fact, one of the things that, as I mentioned, that the government policy was that women had to be sent across to the country which was connected with their religion. So abducted Muslim women had to be sent to Pakistan, abducted Hindu and Sikh women had to be brought to India without any choice being given to them. And this was something that actually became an issue between Rameshwari Nehru and Mridula Sarabhai also. Rameshwari Nehru felt that women should have a lot more input into it, while Mridula Sarabhai was looking at it from a point of view also of just logistics, and felt that, at the moment, the best you could do was send the women back to their community. In Amritsar itself, Mohinder Singh Chopra's wife tried to get a lot of these women married to the army Jawans who were under her husband. Her husband was in the army at that time. And, so that they could begin their lives and be married and be accepted in society. This is a painting called Refugee Train Late 16 Hours by Krishan Khanna. A lot of women, children were sent across the border before violence actually broke out, or when things were still slightly better. They were sent ahead by their families. This was true, as I said earlier, for the lady who's given us the Fulkari quote. She had been sent across the border with her young brother, while the parents came across later. So a lot of the women were already across the border. The other interesting thing that we've noticed is that a lot of women seemed to feel and understand that violence would break out before the men accepted it. Even within my family, my great-grandmother, when violence first started breaking out, decided that she would carry across all the more expensive things in the family, the better quilts, the better mattresses, across the border to Ropar, to the ancestral home that had been left 50, 60 years before, and keep it there and, keep going between her home in Layalpur and the home in Ropar, taking things across the border. While her husband, my great-grandfather, refused to accept that partition could actually happen, or that they would be forced to leave their homes. And he only left Layalpur when there was no other choice given, and everybody had to leave. And I think it's also sort of, connects with the fact that for women, they understood that if violence did break out, they had so much more to lose. Even in terms of just being the violence that they would face would be so much more than anything that a man could face. And they were therefore much more willing to look at the facts straight on and not get emotional about the fact that this might mean leaving their homes. They were willing to look at it more practically by saying that, we can get things across the border and then come back if things get better. But for now, we need to accept that this might be something that may happen. In this painting that Krishan Khanna's made, he was at Ambala at that time. And the trains would come across the border, and Ambala was a huge refugee camp. And he remembers witnessing these scenes where people would be waiting for the trains to come across from Pakistan, but the train might be delayed, it wouldn't reach. You had no idea what had happened to the train, whether the people on it were safe or not. And he sort of captures that despair, that hopelessness, the uncertainty that the families, largely women and children, who are waiting for the menfolk to come across on the train while waiting at the station. These are paintings by Satish Gujral and S.L. Parashar. Satish Gujral was himself also involved in helping refugees, and he crossed the border many times, helping with the rehabilitation team, helping refugees being brought across the border. S.L. Parashar himself was the camp commandant at Ambala, and he was extremely disturbed by the scenes that he saw, the hopelessness that he saw amongst the people sitting there, waiting there. And because he was an artist, he was earlier at the Mayo College of Arts in Lahore, he decided to deal with his emotions by sketching whatever he saw on whatever scraps of paper that he could find, with whatever material that he could find. So a lot of his sketches and paintings are on scraps of notebook paper, or the leftover paper from documents, capturing the immediacy of the scenes that he was witnessing around him. Life for women after they came across wasn't easy. A lot of them became widows. They were widows before they even migrated. They might have lost their husbands before 1947, before the violence of 47. But after they came across, they were widows who did not have that family support system. They did not have a place to stay often. Many women became widows in the violence of 1947. Others were separated from their family and may not have been accepted back by them. And these were women who had never been on their own. So for them particularly, life was extremely difficult. Many of them may never have worked outside. Many of them may have been in Parda all their life. And for them, being in a refugee camp where there was no privacy was an extreme shock. This is Mrs. Savar, whose family migrated from Kotla Nihang Khan near Ropar to Lahore. And one of the things her mother was a widow before 47. Her father had died when she was very young. The family, when she migrated with her mother and her siblings to Lahore, they were in the Walton refugee camp at Lahore for a very long time. And ultimately, family members helped find them a house. But she remembers that when they walked in, her mother saw that the chula, the stove, had burnt rotis on it, because whoever had lived in that house, whichever Hindu or Sikh family had earlier lived in that house, had left in such a hurry that they had not even, that the stove was still burning when they left. And her mother saw that, and she said that I cannot live in this house because whoever lived here had gone through the same trauma that she had of leaving the house. And she said, I don't want a house which has been forcefully taken from the people who lived here before. And so they left that house, continued living in a camp for more time until they finally moved in with some relatives much later. This picture is from 1946. It was taken in Larkana in Sindh. Larkana is the hometown of the Bhuttos. And it's a picture that shows these two young Sindhi women. And after migration, there were other changes that women had to incorporate into their daily life. This included food, language, and dress. So usually Sindhis wore kurta pajamas, as you can see in the woman on the left. That was the dress of the Sindhi women. However, many of the Sindhis, they migrated to Gujarat or to Bombay, and where they talk about how they were expected to wear saris, and it was extremely uncomfortable and difficult for them. So the stories of Sindh, of course, is a completely different topic. It's a huge topic on its own. The Sindhis didn't only lose, they lost an entire province, while Bengal and Punjab still got half a province in both the countries. The Hindustani Sindhis completely lost the province, they lost their language, and they faced a much more harsher disconnect with the culture that had existed before. After partition, a lot of women were encouraged to take up jobs to keep themselves busy, as I mentioned earlier with Gulshan Nanda's sister Nandini, who also worked on this. They were encouraged to take up the charkha, to continue spinning. Spinning used to be earlier a group activity, a community activity in the different villages where women would gather together and work on the charkha. They were encouraged to do that again, to build a community amongst themselves, but also to work on it to be able to earn a livelihood for themselves. And this was highly pushed by the government, who tried to get the women to become self-sufficient as quickly as possible, to the extent possible. This lady's name is Lalita Sahani. She migrated from Hazara in Pakistan as a child. And growing up in Kingsway Camp, she saw her elder brothers attending school and also wanted to attend so as to be able to make a better life for herself. But her mother did not approve. However, Lalita persisted against her family's objections and went on to graduate from college also. So, following the partition, many women took the opportunity to break away from patriarchal traditions and chose to study further and took up jobs to become self-sufficient. Some women succeeded in doing this, other women did not. Some women felt that, that shock of coming out of Parda was too extreme and they could never reconcile themselves to this new life where they did not have any protection. Other women felt that this was a chance to break the cage that they had been held in all their life, to go out and experience this new life, get educated, get a job, have independence, and build a better life for themselves. The changes in women's lives upended society and culture. On the left, you have this a burqa belonging to Tikka Rani Jagjit Kaur Bedi, who had kept strict parda until 1947. When fleeing from a place called Kallar Bediya, she had worn this burqa while escaping. But once she came across to India, she never wore a burqa again and never kept parda again. So that is one aspect of how women moved forward. However, another aspect that is beautifully depicted in Ritwik Ghatak's films is that women also were exploited for their labor once they entered into the workforce, often by their own families, when the families themselves could not deal with the fact that they had lost their lives, and women could enter into the workforce, becoming dependent on her and not wanting her to have her own life, but to earn for the family. And that, of course, is one of the best films on that is Meghe Dhaka Tara. Many scholars have been working on the stories and the experiences of women, which remained an ignored subject for a very long time. But since the 1980s, there's been a lot of work on it. These two books by Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin are, of course, the seminal works on it. There are other researchers who continue work on it, and even now work is being done on it. However, there is a silence that still surrounds the experiences of women. At the Partition Museum, we realized that when we were reaching out to people and we wanted to interview them for the Partition Museum, people would put us in touch with the men in their family. They would put us in touch with their fathers or their grandfathers or their uncles, while the women would not be the first people that they thought of often. The grandmothers, the sisters. Women themselves were not as forthcoming. They were not used to either speaking publicly, especially the elderly women who were in their late 80s or their early 90s, or they thought that the information that they have is not as important because they did not have political information. Since a lot of them were in Parda or they stayed inside the house, they said we weren't really aware of what was happening outside in the world, so we don't really have anything to say. However, one of the experiences that we had sort of portrays the importance of the women's experience also. We had interviewed these two gentlemen from a family who had migrated from Pakistan. And once we'd finished interviewing them, we realized that there was an elderly lady also sitting who had been hearing the interviews being conducted. And I turned to her and asked her if she had also come across at Partition. And she was the elder sister-in-law of those two gentlemen. She was in her early 90s, while those two men had been in their 80s. And their memories of the two men had been very much of children and what they remembered. So I asked her if, she had any memories, and she just said that no, whatever they said, that's true. That's all that I have to say. The two gentlemen had mentioned that their neighbors had been a Muslim family with whom the family had a close connection. Their fathers used to interact with them. The children, those two gentlemen used to play with the children of the Muslim family. So I asked this lady that whether the women had also interacted with each other. And she said, no, we all kept a strict parda. They kept strict parda. We kept strict parda. So we had no interaction with them. But then she said that, when they were leaving, the day they were leaving and the Tongas had come and they were getting on the Tongas to leave from there and migrate to India, the Muslim ladies who had never stepped outside of their house came and met these Hindu ladies who were migrating and handed them food, cooked food, and said that we know that that you don't usually eat food that has been cooked by us, but you don't know where you're going, you don't know how long it will take. So please take this food that we have cooked, at least for the sake of your children. And that's a story that I don't think could have come from any man. It was an interaction that happened between women. It was women who thought of food, who thought about the food that the migrating family would need when they were going across. And it was an interaction solely between the women of the two communities. So I think it's just very important that we continue to interview and focus on the stories of the women, separate from that of the general interviews that we conduct. And at the Partition Museum, we're making a deliberate and constructive effort to do so. Women's voices constitute an important part of the story of the partition, and it's a little bit of that we've shared with you today. Thank you. Just before I end, we are on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And do reach out to us if you have any stories that you'd like us to conduct or anything that that you can contribute to the museum. We would love to hear from you. And we would love to, we hope that you can visit the Partition Museum at Amritsar and hopefully in Delhi when it opens later this year.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dhillon, for that very informative session. You have definitely given us a lot to think about when it comes to women's experiences during the partition and the importance of preserving oral and material memories to build our understanding of this event. So we have some time left in today's session. So we will be taking up some questions that we have received. So the first one is, how do you interpret the denial of prospective violence by men and the early anticipation of it by women? How do we analyze this disparity along the lines of gender?
So yeah, as I mentioned, I think it's very much focused on the fact that for men, I think, especially for men who were established in their field, who were doing well, who were in their, who were 30 or above, just accepting the fact that they would need to leave their homes meant that they would need to start their life from scratch again. And that was something that they just found extremely difficult to imagine. Perhaps also for many of the men, they had interacted with people of the other community, whether in their schools or colleges or in a professional, at a professional level in their jobs. And perhaps they thought that, there was an understanding and this could not possibly happen. Of course, one of the lines that everybody talks about is that, people would say that hukumatein badalti hain, log thoda chhod ke jate hain. So while for the women, I think once the initial violence broke out, because they perhaps, and I'm only guessing here, perhaps because they did not really have that much of an interaction, it was easier to other the other community. Plus also the fear that they faced, like, early on you had stories of the women being raped, whether it was at Noakhali or in Bihar or in Rawalpindi, all of which is happening 6 months to a year before the partition. Once the stories come into the popular memory, the women sort of could imagine that happening to themselves, and the fear of that was also much stronger amongst them than it would have been for the men. So I would guess that perhaps that was one of the reasons.
So next it says, hello, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I, Yash, am a research assistant at CSMVS and a scholar working with Sindhi partition memories, material history and oral history of Sindhi women, especially especially at the intersection of food and family on both national and international levels. I really appreciate the focus on feminine remembrance because it is indeed overlooked in partition documentation. And here is the question. During my continuing work with Sindhi partition narratives, I have realized that memory is a shared phenomena and permeates not only the first generation but also the subsequent ones. How does an institute contextualize post memory? From an academic perspective, how do we negotiate the gaps between the memories of the first generation survivors and the second generation individuals who inherit this memory?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think for now at the Partition Museum, I think we're at a very interesting position where our focus on collecting the oral histories has very much been on the first generation so far, solely because that generation is dying out. We only have them around maybe for another 5 years, 8 years, maybe 10 years, people who actually have the memories. And it's so we are focusing on recording them and, we're focusing on collecting their oral histories mostly so far. However, once I think as we go along, as the years pass, it is the second and third generation histories that will become equally important. And as you said, there's a huge permeation that happens between the first generation and second generation. There are gaps that happen. There are changes that happen in the mindset. So how does an institution contextualize post memory? That is not something that the Partition Museum has specifically looked at in the sense of in the sense of this question. At the same time, I would say that considering that the museum is very much sharing these stories for the current generation to tell people about what happened then and to give as overall a picture as possible, I think that is how we are working on it. That if you come from a partition family, and many people who suffered at partition don't really know what happened with their grandparents and never had the opportunity to ask, you can come and at least get a sense of what your grandparents went through and know more about it. To maybe, even if it's just to ask more questions, or even if you have your grandparents around, it gives you a chance to go back and ask them questions about it and look at it from different points of view, ask them questions from a different angle. The second question was, from an academic perspective, how do we negotiate the gaps between the memories of the first generation survivors and second generation individuals who inherit this memory? That's, I think, again, a very interesting question. There's in fact a recent book that has come out. I think it's called Inherited Memories. It's been done by the German Institute in Delhi, and it looks at it looks at the stories that have been the memories that have been taken in, focusing on the Bengal partition. So both from stories from Bangladesh, East Pakistan, and Bengal. So I think for now I would just refer you to that book. I don't really have much to add to it at this point of time.
So the next question is by Kavya. At the time of recovery, how were women identified, for they had been given new identities?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Thank you, Kavya, for that question. It's very interesting that a lot of the women who were abducted, their families often knew who had abducted them and where they were being kept. And this is something that is often ignored, or we don't realize it when we look at it from an overall picture of the partition and of abduction. A lot of the women were abducted, like even when a village was attacked, even if it was not somebody from the village who attacked, it would be somebody from a neighboring village. It would be the local gundas, whom everybody knew was a local gunda and, had been throwing his weight around before the partition, before the violence actually broke out. After they were abducted and taken into the different homes, even if they were moved, people sort of would talk, so-and-so has a woman kept in his house and he's converted her and he wants to marry her. there would be rumors that would go around. So the recovery of women teams that were set up on both sides of the border, they would in fact go from village to village and try and talk to the villagers there, and try and see if they could find out if a woman was living there. Sometimes the villagers would be of help, and they might identify and say that that person or that family or that house has somebody who's been abducted and kept there. At other times, they might all be involved in not letting that woman be found. So often, if the police or the people who were the police mainly who was supposed to be helping the recovery team might have their sympathies with the villagers, so they would sort of tell them that tomorrow we'll be coming for a raid, and the women would be moved out to the outhouses or into the villages and hidden there. The women themselves would be scared and told that, we are just checking if you've actually accepted your new life or not. So if you stand up and if someone asks that, are you a Hindu, and you say you're a Hindu or a Muslim, depending on where you were, we would kill you. So, there were measures being taken to try and keep them quiet. At the same time, it was often very much known. In fact, if you look at Urvashi Butalia's book on the section on the recovery of abducted women, she shared one page from a list of women that was made of the abducted women. And even on that one page list that has been shared in the book, it says the name of the people and where they are thought to have been kept, in which village, which area. Similarly, even if you come to the Partition Museum, we've put up a couple of letters that people had sent, where they've said that, there's this one letter by a Muslim gentleman written to the recovery team saying that my brother's family, while they were migrating from Dehradun, was attacked, and my brother was killed, and his family was entirely killed except for his elder daughter. And I have come to know that she is being kept in so-and-so village, in so-and-so's house. So can you please help me find her? So it's just very interesting that we don't realize today that actually a lot of women often knew, like a lot of family members knew where the women were. At the same time, many of these women would then be moved from place to place, which is why you have all the stories of people going and looking for the women who had been left behind during the pilgrimages or when they went, whenever borders opened.
So we have another question here which asks, what was the status of women's literacy during partition?
Sorry, can you just repeat that, please?
Yeah. What was the status of women's literacy during partition?
I don't have the numbers right now. I actually don't know if there was, I can tell you that what was the status of women's literacy during partition. But on this, there is the last chapter of Ritu Menon's book focuses on the change in the women's literacy at partition, and what were the numbers of women who started attending school following partition in Delhi, how many of them were refugee women who started attending school, and I think that's the best that I can direct you towards. I don't have it in front of me, but that's where I could direct you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So it says here, as an institution that focuses on intangible collections in the form of oral memories, do you face any particular advantage or disadvantage in collection as compared to collecting actual museum objects?
I think one big advantage is that because our focus is on intangible oral histories, we can get them from anywhere around the world. And it's easier to collect them to some extent by even doing online oral history recordings, which we've been doing especially during COVID. But also before that, if people reached out to us from Canada or the US or England or across the border, because that's something that's difficult to do being in India. So that is one huge advantage that I think we have. The disadvantage is in showcasing those the oral histories that we have. Many of the oral histories, sometimes on an average, they're about 30 minutes to an hour, and there are so many stories. And while on the one hand, you could say they're same stories. I feel that like every oral history that you conduct, there is something new, there is something different. It's a very personal reaction. And how do you then share all of that with everyone? In the Partition Museum at Amritsar, for instance, we have about 50 TV monitors playing clippings of 4 to 5 interviews each on each monitor of 2 to 5 minutes. And even a visitor, can't take it all in one day. They're different, and each of the stories covers a different aspect. So I think just like putting, and even there, we're just sharing one clip from one interview taken in that context of whatever we are showcasing. But of course, that information is coming from a larger background, and it always helps to know what kind of a background that person's coming from. All of which is in the longer interview, which everyone cannot always hear, or you don't have the time to do that. So I think just how to then showcase the history in a manner that is coherent, that is understandable, that works for the visitors, is something that we really need to work on.
And one last thing which I think everyone will benefit is that could you share any open resources or any contacts if people want to reach out to the museum, and because we have a lot of questions that are still there.
Yeah.
So if you could direct people to that, it would be.
Yeah, sure. So I had shared that in the last slide of my presentation, but you can reach out to us at info at partitionmuseum.org. And we also, generally, as I said, because there's only so much that we can put up in the museum, we do put up a lot more of our information from our archives on social media. We share on, a lot of the things that we share on social media, in fact, are not in the museum. We try and cover newer aspects there. So you can do follow us on social media, and you can reach out to us on social media also. We often do talks on Instagram. We work, we do interactions. So that would be the easiest way to reach out to us.
So thank you so much for answering so many questions and for that wonderful talk. We had a great experience here, and thank you to everyone who joined in today, and have a very good evening, all of you.
Thank you so much, Arthri, for inviting the Partition Museum, and thank you everyone for attending it.
Okay. Thank you.